Across the gospel spectrums, which each add, different flares and understandings of the text. You might have noticed, for instance, that Luke's call of Peter is already different because they'd already technically met the day before. Jesus had already performed a miracle in Peter's presence. Thus, he knew to call him Master. It was, in fact, perhaps the very fact that he knew Jesus to be a miracle worker that Simon felt so deeply unworthy of being in Jesus' presence. A fun little thing we'll play with some more. How does Peter get from here in that text, in this text in which Peter feels unworthy of Jesus, in which Peter does not wish to be caught up in any grand stories? Peter, who is probably already married, we know he's already married, he has a mother-in-law, probably still married, potentially widowed, we never see her, but they live there on the shores of Galilee where he is a fisherman. Because he's already got his own boat, he's not in his dad's boat, he's probably mid-20s, he's struck out on his own, continuing a family trade for sure, but he's the man of the house, and he's prepared to live his life anonymously. In fact, perhaps he imagines that's all he's good enough to do. You see, he tried to become once a disciple of the rabbis, but the letters just didn't stick in his brain right. He couldn't read the text as well as they wanted him to be able to do. He had a deep and life-giving faith, but the words just couldn't come together for him. And when they sent him back to learn his family trade and said, "You're not good enough to stay here, no rabbi will choose you," he took that word to heart, right? "Master, go away from me, for I am a sinful man. I'm not good enough for you. You need someone better than me." That's where we find Peter in his story. Now, let's call this the halfway of his point of his story. We'll call this Acts 2. What happens in Acts 2? Remember? Kind of a big holiday for us. Pentecost, right? Peter gives that huge, stirring Pentecost speech. All you people from throughout Asia Minor and all of the provinces who have gathered here this day, you who think that we're speaking in tongues because we're drunk, that's not it. You remember that speech? A speech so stirring and bound up with such authority that thousands joined the Jesus way that day. Peter's story beyond the biblical text continues. By far the most named disciple, we know that he rises to a forefront of the Jerusalem council following Jesus' death. Politics settle in, right? So James the Just begins to have, with his conservative faction, more power. They look askance at Peter, but they let him in to the council still. Not like that Paul guy, flaming liberal, right? And in the balance of power, Peter starts to become the moderate, trying to hold the church together from this conservative faction and this pagan welcoming liberal Paul. So that James looks askance at Peter and Paul calls him out for his lack of purity politics. But Peter goes on to be named the bishop of Antioch in this first place they begin to claim the word Christians. He becomes this ongoing, emerging figure of the church. Here is Peter, upon whom I will build the church. And so, like Jesus named him, he becomes the steady and steadfast presence that holds this fledgling movement together as they argue amongst themselves about whether Hebrews and Greeks have equal right to the bread. And how exactly is the table work? Tradition tells us, though we have no archaeological evidence to warrant the belief, all of the church fathers of the 2nd century claim Peter then continues on to Rome, that he is hand in hand with Paul and starting the church there, and he becomes the bishop of Rome, a tradition that upon which is founded that he was the first pope, passing on that papacy to Linus eventually, after serving for 30 to 40 years as pope, which would have made him the longest running pope of the Catholic Church, until he dies at the hand of Nero in the late 60s in Rome. Crucified, as tradition tells us, upside down, because, and here's the only remaining marker of the Peter we met today, he wasn't worthy to die the way that Jesus did. Turn me upside down. I'm not equal to his death. But it's a death he knew he'd die, because Jesus told him so when he said, "Tend my sheep, and someday they will take you to a place you do not want to go, and they will put a belt around your waist and hang you to death." How is this Peter that Peter? How does someone who feels so unworthy, he wants Jesus to get rid of all these fish and just go away, how does that person, this person who won't be able to walk on water, who raises his hand every day at the beginning of class before Jesus asks the question, so he has no idea what we're supposed to be talking about, how does that guy with the brown all over his nose and the uncertainty in his heart become that guy? That's what we're trying to figure out together this season of Lent. Because we get Peter, don't we? We get this Peter, don't we? Peter of the wandering heart. Peter who isn't worthy of this calling. Peter who is overwhelmed, perhaps, to imagine that anyone would expect anything of him more than a few measly fish, just enough to pay the bills and feed the family with what's left over. There's a comfort, I think, for Peter in that level of expectation, right? He's been told he wasn't good enough until he believed it. And when Jesus comes along and sees in Peter something no one else saw, he's like, it's maybe easier just to live with no expectations. And yet somehow, well, he got that thumb stuck in his net. And Jesus pulled him along for the ride. And we'll see again and again, step after step, time after time, when Peter missteps, when Peter wanders away, when Peter finds himself out in the deep water, he will remember to turn back to Jesus. He will remember that he isn't alone. He will remember that he doesn't need to know all the answers. He just needs to hold on to the belief that God is in this story with him. God is in this boat with him. And that unrelenting possibility, well, not to spoil the story, but I already did, will take him to places we could never have imagined. He could never have imagined. That Dr. Seuss book you got when you graduated high school or college. Oh, the places you'll go. So let us, this season of Lent, be willing to go those places with Peter. To hear those stories Jesus invites him into, and through him us. And dare to imagine that the power of the unrelenting, steadfast presence of God means you truly are, we truly are capable of anything, and maybe everything. This is the word of our Lord.